Let's do this. All right, guys, welcome to this week's edition of Advancing Your Position. This is the Checkmat Fallbrook Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu podcast. Our mission here is basically to have a forum to pick the brains of various professionals in our community and have them share some of their expertise on subjects that aren't specifically jiu-jitsu related, but have a broad applicability and interest to kind of all of us in this community who like to approach life with the same strategy that we approach our jiu-jitsu game, always trying to kind of be a little bit better than we were yesterday and always trying to take where we are and move one step forward and advance our position. All right. So today's podcast, last week we got into talking a little bit about this crazy pandemic that we're dealing with right now, which I think if you asked anybody at the beginning of 2020 what they thought this year was going to be, I don't think this was it. The big meme that was going around that went viral at the end of last year was, man, 2019 sucked. 2020 is going to be the year. And 2020 was like, hold my beer. So here we are. We got into a little bit about emergency management and how are we navigating this pandemic situation last week. And I shared some of my background and expertise coming from airport management and risk management from a corporate perspective, and then a little bit from my experience as a pilot and learning how to deal with when stuff goes bad, what do we do? Just to kind of help everybody put a framework around how we're navigating these crazy times right now. Because I think a lot of people are sitting back going, what are we supposed to be doing? And we talked about sort of identifying what our needs are and how we come up with alternative ways to meet those needs during times when operations are irregular. And that was the title of last week's podcast. So I wanted to dig into a couple of those subjects this week a little bit and get a little bit more specific. And our guest today is Alex Trafton, who is one of my favorite risk management, crisis expert, disaster preparedness people. Former training partner and followed on Facebook for many, many years now. So I've gotten to kind of follow his career a little bit and listen to how he talks and approaches managing different crisis situations. And I think we share a lot of the same viewpoints. So Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And maybe you can share a little bit about your bio. You can probably explain it a little bit better than I can.
Sure. I mean, I think so. The recent one in the last 10 years, I've spent a lot of time in different ends of working in high risk environments and in crisis environments. From on the ground, I worked in conflict zones as a security advisor for journalists for many years, and moved more towards the corporate direction now, where we do crisis management training and response for large companies and small companies as well. And that's now kind of pivoted more into the cyberspace as threats have evolved, and I think we'll get into some of that today. But I think that's basically the short form. And yeah, like I said, we've known each other for a while and had a lot of back and forth on social media, and it's always nice to see people in our community who have experience outside of just jiu-jitsu, and we get to learn from each other in other ways, and not just through training jiu-jitsu. So it's been social media has really made that easy, and now it's kind of like the one lifeline we have to each other now that we're kind of locked away. So I feel very fortunate to have everybody in from the community still connected.
It's true. We want to take advantage of that. So one of the things I kind of mentioned last week was everybody's boat navigating this storm. We're all in the same storm. Everybody's boat looks a little bit different. So this pandemic is going to mean different things for different people, depending on kind of what your life was before, for one thing. Everybody's got different resiliency to deal with any kind of a crisis situation. And then the specifics of the crisis situation, just depending on what your role is in life, what it is that you do. We talked a little bit about some industries are super impacted in a negative way, and other industries have seen this great big boost, like Zoom, for example. So it really kind of depends. It's going to impact everybody a little bit differently. Everybody's boat is a little bit different. And another area or another way that everybody's boat is different is in the area of disaster preparedness and how we prepare ourselves and plan in advance to deal with disaster situations and how that's going to affect our resiliency when something does happen. And I'm sure all of you guys have, that one friend who's like the doomsday preparer, and he's got like, a bomb shelter in his backyard, and he's growing like a hydro garden underneath, and, whatever happens in the world, he's going to be the last man standing. It's going to be him and the cockroaches. And on the other hand, you've got those friends out there who don't think at all, like past 5 minutes in front of them right now. They don't know what they're having for dinner tonight, never mind like an emergency preparedness plan. And I think everyone falls on that spectrum somewhere in between. What would you say is an appropriate level of disaster preparedness for like your everyday person who wants to be reasonably prepared, but understanding that it is not their life's mission to prevent every disaster from happening, but
Right.
also not wanting to get caught with your pants down, that anything happens, we become super vulnerable to just having to react in the moment and having no plan at all.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think my scale of what's kind of reasonable isn't maybe well calibrated, because I always felt like developing all these skill sets around surviving in adverse environments, or what we called low resource environments when we worked with journalists, or high risk or non-permissive or hostile environments. And so I spent a lot of time doing things like land navigation and, obviously hand-to-hand combat and shooting and all of these other skills and trauma medicine. And so I think that in those environments, that was probably good training. I always thought the best thing that you could have, and when I worked with other people who worked in those environments, was we would meet, because there would be industry specific meetings or training that we would do together. And the people that were really good and stuck around and survived in that workspace were people that were very, very rational thinkers. And people that could do so under a lot of stress. And I think that's probably the most important thing that you can have, is an ability to think critically and rationally when there's a lot of emotional stimulus going on, things that make you afraid. And people that give in to fear tend not to perform well in those stressful environments. And that's been a truism that I've seen. And so I think on that's kind of prepare yourself. There's some resources, out there to do kind of training for yourself on critical thinking or any of that. But aside from kind of that, which is a little esoteric maybe, but the actual skill sets or the actual things you need, I think Americans are really bad about planning for the future. And I think that we live in a pretty well-resourced environment where we have everything we need. They'll bring food to your door. Life is so convenient now that we don't really imagine a world without this. And even modest inconveniences tend to drive people crazy. The first thing people went and did was buy toilet paper, which right. Had kind of bearing on survivability of a disaster, but it was the first thing people did, and it was just a kind of a panic, a stampede of people doing that. But it didn't really enhance their resiliency. And I think a lot of the resiliency you'd want as a person or in a household would come before a crisis. And when we do crisis management coaching kind of on the corporate side, you have companies that bring you in to develop their crisis management capabilities. And that's a consulting role. And those companies do very well in crises because they can immediately manage their crisis internally. We have the skills. We understand what we need to do. We have a stockpile of N95 masks, right? Those kind of things. And then there's the people that call and say, we need a crisis management program in the moment. And those right. people do not prepare as well, because you're trying to do the solution as the building's falling, And I think a lot of people should probably approach their own disaster preparedness in that way, because there's kind of two pieces to it. There's managing the crisis, and there's disaster recovery. So are you ready for the crisis? And then how well do you recover? Because everybody's going to get hit. And I think so. Some of those things come down to your planning, and doing it in the moment is always hard. But if you lay out a plan, and your PowerPoint is pretty good about understanding, well, what am I going to national solid planning would be your best, because you really know what it looks like. Have, roughly two kinds of risk when we look at risk as a broad field. You have structural risk, which is what everybody assumes, just being alive in that area. So California, structural risk for us is an earthquake, right? Everyone's victim to the earthquake, right? There's no amount of money you can have in Beverly Hills where the earthquake doesn't affect your house, right? Fires are another one. Those are risks we take on just by being in California, or in Florida, hurricane season is a structural risk. Variable risks are things that we take on individually, like we talked about yesterday. Base jumping, if I shatter my spine base jumping, that's a variable risk. It's not something everyone around me suffers, right? That's something I chose to do. And so looking at those two pieces of risk and what decisions can I make to reduce variable risk right? And what I can do in terms of crisis management and disaster recovery that can manage that structural risk, which is, growing up in California, you grew up in New York, I grew up in California. So we were always worried about, do we have enough water in the pantry in case there's an earthquake that ruptures the water lines? Those were good, like, resiliency strategies that would, come in handy in kind of any disaster. So I think, managing your risk, having a plan, and making sure you think through things rationally are probably the three most important things I could probably recommend to anyone, short of like which, freeze-dried food you should buy, right?
All right, cool. A strategy I talked about a little bit last week was making sure we're being very specific, about identifying what threat we're talking about right now. So like we're saying now, you mentioned that everyone kind of went out and panic bought toilet paper, which didn't really represent an appropriate response to increase someone's resilience based on what the specific threats are with coronavirus. And we talked a little bit about yesterday about that we have two threats here that we're dealing with, and one is the virus itself, and that's an illness situation, and then two is the secondary kind of response and pandemic management. Some of that is from a government regulatory level, and then some of that is just dealing with people hoarding all the toilet paper.
Right.
So there's kind of two threats we're dealing with here, and kind of drilling down a little bit. We have, specific threats to resources, and then safety and security and property. And those were the things I really wanted to get into with you today. What do you see in this particular crisis that we're dealing with right now that are the specific threats to resources? And how would you recommend that people insulate themselves a little bit from dealing with that risk?
I think a lot of that risk is manufactured. When we looked, at a company-wide at work, we looked at one of our things we do is secure supply chains, from logistics to, information security to physical security. And there was just literally no threat to supply chains. We really couldn't find anything. Now we have some workforce reduction that can have a little outsized effect. And then if there was an outsized demand in like secure devices for work from home, there was a supply chain pressure there to get enough devices out. But those aren't critical, those aren't life critical. You had Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're down with the food, water, air, it's well up that chain when we start looking at where supply chain issues are with that. And then there's the PPE supply chain issue for masks and gloves and things like that. But yeah, there wasn't really an absolute necessity. And it was so interesting that toilet paper became the theme, because diarrhea is just not a symptom of coronavirus. So it's like, why are people out there buying toilet paper? But in terms of resources, so if you expanded kind of the current crisis a little bit, and you looked at, if things kind of the worst case scenario after worst case scenario, if there's a threat to resources, if the resources aren't available, there's very little you can do to find them. We don't really want to end up in a situation where, we're out stealing from our neighbors and stuff. I always tell people that, if you live in that post-apocalyptic fantasy where you're kind of, tattered clothes with your crossbows walking through the city streets, things have gone really bad, and maybe we should reevaluate if we want to be alive in that situation. But I think with resource constrained environment, it really comes down to the planning and how do we get our resources ahead of time, because it's really difficult.
All right, sorry about that. We were talking about specific threats to resources and hoarding the toilet paper.
Right. Yeah. And so I think it really comes down to being resilient ahead of time. It's standing in line at Costco during a pandemic is probably not what you want to be doing.
For sure.
I went into Costco. I can't remember what I was going to get, but it had just started the kind of early March, probably the panicking, not panicking, but the pressure to get stuff, I guess, had set in. And I went into Costco and I looked at the line, and it was huge. And I went, oh my God. And someone was like, I touched his face. I'm leaving, but I think that having the necessity. So, if you really drill down into a low resource environment, you probably wouldn't be getting fresh food. Like I like, fresh fruit with my breakfast, So, but if that goes away, what kind of food stores do you have? Can you shelter in your house for 2 weeks, right? With what you have? And most people, the answer is probably no. And I think a lot of that's driven by economic pressure that a lot of Americans don't have, that live paycheck to paycheck, can't afford that. So you have an economic issue for people. And then the people that are economically mobile enough to afford it, a lot of them probably don't plan for it. And then everyone, humans are really good at dealing with kind of like proximal threats. If you look at evolution, like the threat that's close to us is the one we prioritize. The saber-toothed tiger is going to jump out of the bush and eat us.
Right.
It's a virus that we're worried about or something in the long term. And so I think we're really bad at conceptualizing these kind of threats until it's too late. And, we're really good at conceptualizing kind of near-term threats like, people are always worried about crime, even though the murder rate has plummeted in the United States. People are so paranoid about this, but that's a proximal threat to people, while pandemic or hurricanes or earthquakes, those are kind of distant threats. And so they don't really prioritize them. So they probably don't have the resources, things that I would have, for something like this, cold and flu medication, not necessarily for coronavirus, but as if you just get the flu, right? You don't want to go to the hospital, right? And if it's mild coronavirus or it's a mild COVID-19 case, how can you mitigate some of those symptoms? Basic trauma medicine equipment. What happens if I do get injured, right? I need treatment, but there's overloaded hospitals, things like that. Basic food for 2 weeks. I always carry enough water too for that, just in case it's because of an earthquake, if water lines are ruptured. Camping supplies, like not to go camping, but in case you need to like heat up food and there's no gas or whatever, there's a million ways you can work it where this becomes necessary. Things like that. And I think people tend to buy like guns and ammunition, and that's always interesting. When we teach firearms courses, and it's always the guy with a $10,000 gun and 10 cents in training, right? It's better to invest in the skills and deal with an equipment shortage than to have robust equipment supplies and no training on how to use it.
For sure.
Some of those skills are, understanding basic trauma medicine, CPR, AED, life support, basic life support. What happens if someone in your household just has a heart attack and it's going to take the ambulance a while to get there? And, those seem to be more proximal threats to me, or more realistic threats rather than having a World War Z type scenario.
Right. Well, gosh, we hope so. That kind of brings me into my next question, though. You often do see this correlation of crime increasing during times of crisis, or there's something else going on. And I think we talked a little bit about yesterday, a lot of that is opportunistic, and, law enforcement resources might be thin already and, spread thin just due to dealing with whatever the actual crisis is. So that you do often see that crime spike and looting and things like that happen when there are other emergency situations going around.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about, what do you see causing that correlation, besides what I just said, and how can we insulate ourselves from that? What is the appropriate response we can take to protect our homes and our property from dealing with secondary crimes of opportunity?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because we just rolled out a product at work, a crime index, where so most crime reporting in the U.S. is done by a couple companies, and they focus on kind of lagging data from the FBI statistics, and they do it at a county level. We started using AI to track real-time 911 calls and get down to a neighborhood, so we can give within a mile what are the crime trends in your area, and we feed it data. So it's these PhDs in data science and an AI-driven algorithm, and we feed it data from like 2014 to 26 or 2012 to 2015. We feed it data, then we ask it to predict the real data we know from 2016 to 2018 and see how accurate the algorithms are. So we're looking at how do we predict crime. And so one of the variables that it's difficult to do, because this trends with economic factors and but human motivation factors is always the hardest part, and we're just learning how to account for human motivation factors in predicting crime, and we're getting better at it. Luckily, all those people are way smarter than me, so they can handle all that. But that's the key, is that human motivation factor, right? So we can trend crime versus property price. So as property prices go up, crime tends to go down, right? Things like that, but those short-term human motivational factors, right? Like pandemic, panic, disasters, those do tend to trend with crime. So, I spent a month in Puerto Rico after I think it was Hurricane Maria, and there was an uptick in crime. Of course, here's the interesting thing: we were down there providing mobile security for reconstruction, which was telecom network reconstruction. And so as soon as you get those rumors, they're hijacking National Guard trucks at Machete Point. Of course, none of that was happening. There was an uptick in crime, there was an uptick in higher end profit crime, hijacking supply trucks. But I think the reaction to that was outsized. So yes, there is going to be an uptick in crime probably, but I think the perception of that uptick is going to be like the perception of the need to buy toilet paper is going to be outsized. Because we were sending 2 vehicles with 4 people each in the vehicles, fully armed with body armor and rifles to escort trucks of water, and nobody was hijacking them. Everyone was very happy to see us, and so I think the perception versus the reality is one issue. But I think the basics of any kind of home security program, making sure you have proper locks on your doors, outside lighting, depends on what kind of house you have. If you're in a high-rise apartment building, you're a little bit more insulated. But if you take the American home, which is kind of 2.5 kids and a dog, right? And outside lighting, motion detection lighting, a camera system visible that people know they're being watched. Make sure you have get into the depth, but the right size screws on your hinges on your doors. So it's harder to kick it in. Just things like that. And there's it's amazing, the internet. You can go on YouTube and probably find a better tutorial on any one of those individual things. Don't leave things visible of value in your car from your windows. And, if you have valuables and firearms, keep them locked in a safe and things like that, I think are pretty big things that would apply anytime,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just don't make yourself the target if there's crimes of opportunity out there.
Right. I mean, if someone identifies you as the person they want to rob, and they're reasonably good at being a criminal, and a lot of criminals who are career criminals are good at doing it, and they go to prison and they get a PhD and then they come out. They really want you, they'll get you. That's why I say that. So I always just we called it security through anonymity. If you drive up in a vehicle with guys in suits and sunglasses and the guy gets out, people have no idea who this guy. I worked for a client like this. No one knew who he was. A multi-international billionaire, but nobody knew who he was. And he would drive in like a Rolls Royce and 7 Range Rovers and his Lamborghini. Now everyone's interested. You could have driven up in a Volkswagen, gotten out by yourself, got your coffee and left, and no one would have been the wiser. And you would have been way safer,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so not attracting attention for sure. Another area, we talked a little bit about having some vulnerability in this particular time, particularly while we're doing all of this social distancing and we're staying at home and, companies and everybody's working from home. We have all of this exposure all of a sudden. We have a lot more traffic on the internet and a lot more exposure to internet. And what that lends itself to is increased cybercrime and those types of opportunities.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what those risks are for individuals? Because even some of the conversation we had yesterday were things I hadn't even thought about myself for my own exposure. And then what we can be doing to kind of take precautions to insulate ourselves from cyber attacks.
Yeah, and I think on the enterprise level, at the corporate level, it's been a real eye-opening experience because I guess, cybercrime is reasonably new. If you look at the history of crime in human society, right? 20 years, our understanding of cybercrime and the criminals are always ahead of enforcement and mitigation. And so in cybersecurity at the enterprise level for corporations, we tell them, the breach is going to happen, the hack is going to happen. How do you respond? How do you recover? We mitigate, we do the mitigation, but it's going to happen. And so I think that, but those are very specific targets, right? When they hack Target or Anthem or the WannaCry attack, some of these attacks are very targeted. As an individual, the attacks tend to be more of a wider net, right? So unless you're very, very high net worth or you made yourself a very easy target, typically the attacks on people are wide net. And so there's basically 2 kinds of wide net attacks that people are going to do. One is it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's annoying. Being a part of a DDoS attack. And so what that means is that a malactor uses some servers to install malware on a lot of devices. And it used to be just computers. Now we're understanding that the Internet of Things, different devices in your home can be co-opted into this network and used. And then they use these to ping websites and send enough traffic to websites to crash the website. And then it's usually an attack for hire, cyber attack for hire. So, this comes down to having, good password security on your on your router, making sure the admin privileges for your area network are on the network. So meaning someone can't come in and be an admin, elevate their privileges on your local network. So those are that's kind of a wide net. The person would never know who you were. They wouldn't care. They're just looking for vulnerabilities of systems and then installing the malware. The more dangerous one is phishing attacks. And so there's basically two kinds of phishing attacks. One is a general and one is a targeted. So phishing and spear phishing. If you imagine throwing your line in the water versus spearing the fish you see. And so usually those are initiated through email, also through text message now, because the phones now have all of the internet connectivity on them, right? So the text message can initiate that phishing attack. And so what they'll do is ask you, hey, we need you to. They'll find some suspicious. I mean, it should be suspicious looking URL, but they may say, hey, we're your medical insurance provider, and we need you to log in and tell us how you're doing with COVID-19. Oh man, COVID-19, my insurance provider wants to know. You go and you give login details. Like most Americans, your password is probably the same for like 9 accounts, which is a no-no, right? Because now they can access, they go to your bank, they access your bank, they can access more sensitive areas than maybe just your health insurance information. But health insurance information is the most prized in cybercrime because it gives the most information, your social security number, your medical history. It's very detailed personal information. And so that's kind of the phishing attack. The spear phishing attack may be directed directly at you, or they may find, so like I had one wind up in my inbox with a client I've been going back and forth who owed us some money. And so I'll probably be very eager to hear from him. Mm-hmm. Those NDA documents you wanted, click this link. And I look at the email, and it's not his email. It's his name, but it's somebody else's email. So this was a targeted attack at me. I didn't click it, and I told our IT department.
Right.
But I think those attacks are really, really dangerous, and they're especially difficult for people who are older and less tech savvy. And then you add the stress of this pandemic where people are worried about health and consequences. They're more adaptive. We talked about rational decision-making under stress. Well, their emotions are running high. They're less likely to make those rational decisions.
Sure.
And avoiding phishing attacks comes down to really don't click links. Think through what they're asking for. No government organization is going to call. Like the IRS doesn't call and ask for your.
No,
security.
They don't do that.
They don't do that.
Not a thing.
There was the SDG&E scam. You'll probably get hit with this as a business owner now, but they'll call, hey, we're about to shut off your power. Give us a credit card number so we can pay your bill.
Sure.
Right, and that works because they have enough people doing it. So there's enough people giving them credit card numbers that they keep doing it. And so I think some of the things you can do to prepare yourself, don't use one password for multiple accounts. So if you do get a password compromised, this is mitigation. So a breach happens. You give someone your password. Well, it's only to your whatever login for your Strava app or whatever it is for working out. So you don't lose, you don't get your entire life compromised. And you can get little password managers, something called OnePassword, where it's locked, it's biometrically and password locked. And so you have all your passwords and accounts stored in there. And so you have one thing that you need to put your password and your fingerprint in for to give you the passwords. And then you manage all your passwords that way. And that'll save you a lot of trouble if you do screw up and click a bad one. And then you have antivirus on the computer. Make sure you have it, it's up to date, and you run it. We're always lagging. We're lagging, the attacks, our response to attacks is lagging. So your antivirus software is going to be working. It's like the flu vaccine. It's going to be working off of last year's or the most recent attacks where they have enough information about their build that response. And then also some notional AI stuff that looks at suspicious behavior on your computer and can identify. So those are two easy ones. Another thing is biometrics on your phone. I always say when you're traveling over the border, disable biometrics because the government can open your phone. They can't get your password out of you, but they can hold up to your face, the phone, and then access all your information. And that's completely legal. So I always tell people when they're traveling the border, disable biometrics, and back up your data. So usually do a hard drive backup, solid state hard drive backup, which is encrypt the hard drive, and then also have a cloud backup option. And those are some good prevention and then recovery options. So the password management will help mitigate the problem. The antivirus will help, build that firewall against viruses, and then having your data backed up is a recovery strategy. So I think those three, and then maybe some some management of your network permissions on your router, and then I think you're pretty resilient from the cyber, as an individual, from the cyber attack.
Okay. Is there anything people can do? Like a lot of times I get these phishing emails all the time and we get the phone calls. Is there an appropriate like reporting protocol? Like I know enforcement, we talked a little bit about is terrible and often not possible because the
Right.
actors are located out of the United States and there's no follow-up and there's no way to track them. Is
Right.
there anything you should do after receiving like a phishing attack or something like that to report it or do anything to try to help with enforcement?
Yeah. So on the individual level, there's going to be no enforcement. If it's your work email, you report it to your IT or your cybersecurity team. So any company should have a very clear governance structure that encourages reporting. Hey, this came in, or I screwed up and clicked it. They should have they should know immediately that there's an attack or there's a breach. If they don't have that clear reporting, that's a problem because people are going to keep it to themselves and then they're going to be behind the 8 ball. Now, as companies develop profiles of the kind of attacks they're getting, most companies are in some kind of an industry association at the cybersecurity level where they share information on these attacks, and then that's in turn shared with the FBI and the NSA. And so what they can do is then start to build out what kind of networks are involved here. The problem, like you said, a lot of these are foreign companies, so enforcement is a problem, and they don't just necessarily work. They're in this hybrid between cybercrime and advanced persistent threats, which are nation states trying to hack government and also private sector companies. And so some of these people, like in Russia, they're criminals, but the government will hire them to carry out cyber attacks so they can deny that the government did it. It wasn't the Russian government that did it. And that's exactly basically what the North Koreans did, is they hired some cybersecurity or cyber hackers, cyber criminals to hack Sony. And so that a lot of the time these people live outside of the traditional enforcement mechanisms of Western Europe and the United States and Australia, New Zealand. And so there's no mechanism to prosecute them. And some of them are not going to get prosecuted because they're a resource for those governments to kind of be plausible deniability. And so this is how they keep the lights on when they're not doing major nation state level attacks. They're out there, stealing your passwords to try to sell it. If they get your credit card info, they can sell that for $500. Personal health information, PHI, personal health information, a couple $100. So if they hack a data set of 100,000 people, I think in the Yahoo hack there was 1 billion accounts hacked.
Wow.
If they sell that for $1 a piece, $2 a piece, right? That's a lot of money. So your personal information is valuable in bulk, right? So they can make a pretty good chunk of change, and they do it all in Bitcoin, and there's really no way to trace them. So the enforcement isn't there, the reporting isn't there, certainly not on the individual level. At the enterprise level, yes, report that immediately to your IT department.
Okay. All right. So just to close out today, we kind of talked a little bit about everyone has different lives and this pandemic is affecting everybody a little bit differently. I think we've all got kind of us and our listeners here have similar situations. I'm curious for you, because you have kind of a different life. Can you share maybe a story of what is the craziest coronavirus related experience you've been a part of so far since this whole thing started this year?
Man, that's a good question. Nothing too bad. I think on the at work, there's been some interesting stuff happen. I got to remember which of that is subject to NDA and which isn't. I think that's a really good question. I'm trying to.
The story you're going to tell your grandkids about managing coronavirus this one time.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I think probably the outsized reaction and just looking at the stupidity that people engage in at the littlest fear stimulus. The woman yelling at me in Costco. It's just the absurdity of kind of the outsized reaction. I don't know if I have an individual story yet. I mean, going to grocery stores and seeing lines. Everyone was joking about how, Soviet Union was, the lines at the grocery stores and, one virus. And we got empty shelves and lines at the grocery store. And so, growing up with the Soviet Union was collapsing and then seeing that happen, in my own country because a few people got sick. Well, more than a few now, but at the time it was a few people got sick. I think is really going to be absurd in having that comparison to make. And because we grew up, you and I are similar age, and we grew up terrified of the Soviet Union.
Sure.
Then we how fragile they were. And then we turned out to be the same as soon as there was a little bit of fear and capitalism started to crumble. You know, we couldn't get toilet paper.
True story. All right. If there are any last words you want to leave with our listeners today, just the advancing your position approach to managing coronavirus. How do we get to be a little bit better than where we are now? What can people do today just to make one small difference in improving their risk management and their recovery for after this pandemic is over?
I think one thing is to learn from a situation. Any failures you've had or weaknesses you see, use those to learn, and because you'll get another chance at this. There'll be another pandemic one day. There'll be another disaster. That's the most important thing about crisis management, is learning from the last crisis. And the other thing is commit to doing something. You have a lot of time. You got to take a course. There's online courses, cheap free courses that you can do. Sign up for some kind of a course run by a small business that teaches a relevant skill: trauma medicine, land navigation, wilderness survival. Do something, you know, where you can learn a skill that'll make you more resilient in the next disaster, and then do it from someone who runs a small business in the community. And there are plenty of people out there.
That's really great advice. All right. Slay, thank you for sharing all your expertise with us. I really appreciate you taking the time out this morning. This was fun. This is a good one.
Good.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. And thank you guys for listening. We'll be up on Sunday morning, and listen for the next one next week on advancing your position. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody.